Hi, I'm Joey Lovestrand, and I'll be sharing about buy and sell in the lexicon of Chadic languages. This is a brief outline of what I'll be talking about today. I'll do a quick introduction to Chadic languages, and then I'll spend most of the time talking about lexification patterns of the semantic concepts buy and sell in these languages. I'll share a bit about some thoughts on diachronic perspectives for how these lexification patterns came about, and then end with a brief conclusion. The Chadic languages are a family within the Afroasiatic languages. You see here in black on this map. There's three major subfamilies, the West Chadic, Mandara, and East, and a small group of 10 languages called the Massa languages, which are also sometimes considered a separate subfamily. And these make up the 207 Chadic languages. This map shows where all the Chadic languages are. You see there the eastern part of Nigeria, the extreme north of Cameroon, and the south of Chad. And these red dots represent the level of description of Chadic languages in 1921, 100 years ago, as is recorded in Kaleidoscope. And this video will show how the documentation of these languages has progressed over the last 100 years. So we see more and more dots turning to green as we approach the current era. And so there's been a ton of work done describing Chadic languages over the last 100 years. And so we know quite a bit about it, especially in the last 20 years. A lot of new documentation has come out. At this point, we have reasonable documentation, what Harold Thomas-Strom would consider either a grammar or a grammar sketch for almost 100 of the Chadic languages. And also thanks to Harold, I was able to get data for quite a few of these. So I've been able to look at 47 Chadic languages for this particular study. Here's those 47 languages that I've included in this study on a map with different colored dots representing which subfamily of Chadic they're a part of. Okay, I'm going to get right into the lexification patterns. And I'm basically taking a semantic mapping approach and assuming everyone will understand what the concepts buy and sell mean in this context, two concepts that are essentially identical, except that they place a different emphasis on which person is receiving money, which person is receiving goods in a particular transaction. And in some Chadic languages, there's just one word that encompasses both of these meanings, that expresses both of these meanings. I'm going to use the word trade in all caps here to refer to that, to a word that combines both of these meanings, a word that can mean either buy or sell, depending on the context. And for 7 Chadic languages, as far as I could tell, this is the only word that is used for expressing buying and selling the language. There's no specific forms for buy or for sell. Now, this could be possible under reporting. Maybe there are specific forms that just haven't been documented yet. But in other cases, we see that it's not really necessary to have a particular verbal or morphological form for distinguishing buy and sell, because even if it is ambiguous, even if the context doesn't make it clear, you could still disambiguate buy and sell through a prepositional phrase. So if you put in a source prepositional phrase, then that might be the person that the good being exchanged is coming from, and therefore the person that's receiving the money. If you put in a goal prepositional phrase, that might be the person that the good is being exchanged to, therefore the person paying the money. So there's other ways to do this without making a lexical distinction. But despite that, there's still, the majority of Chadic languages do make some distinction between these two concepts, buy and sell. And so for the languages that do have a specific form for sell, that contrasts either with a general word that can mean buy or sell, so a trade word, or it contrasts with a word that's been glossed as buy. And I'll put in a bit of a caveat here because it's not always that clear in descriptive works what the difference is, because many descriptive linguists, myself included, don't really focus on lexical semantics. And so there's several cases where you see a word being described as meaning buy or being glossed as buy, and then you see it used in a context where it gets translated as sell, and that clues me into the fact that actually this word has a wider meaning, but that distinction isn't always clear. But in any case, there's 38 languages where we see this pattern, where there's a specific form for sell, and then another form that either can mean buy or sell or just means buy. Then there's also another minor form where there's just 2 languages that have a general word still that can mean buy or sell, then have specific forms in addition to that for saying specifically that something's that is a buying event versus a selling event. And that's just the case for 2 languages of the 47 in my sample. Now, one thing to note here, the very clear pattern we see across this data is that there's an asymmetry where that if you see that there's a specific form for by in a Chadic language, there is therefore necessarily a specific form for cell as well. In other words, there's no languages where there's only a specific form for by and no specific form for cell. It's not really clear to me why this asymmetry would exist. Why is it the case that if you need to make a distinction between by and cell some point, at least in Chadic languages, they always choose to mark the cell concept differently than the by concept. But in any case, that's a clear pattern throughout all 47 languages in this data. All right, looking at forms of trade and buy throughout these 47 languages, we see actually quite a bit of diversity. It's only in the Biu-Mandara languages, particularly in Biu-Mandara South, that we see a very clear cognate across all the languages. So here's the Central Chadic languages that includes Biu-Mandara North and one Masa language, and Biu-Mandara South and a group of 2 languages that are called the Herza languages. And so here we see this clear pattern with this SKM root that occurs in almost all of the Biu-Mandara South languages and perhaps in Sakun as well. I'm not sure what the relationship would be between that voice lateral fricative and the other possible cognates. So that's potentially a cognate as well. But clearly there's some cognates there. However, if we look at, this is a map of where those SKM roots appear, clearly in a geographical cluster where other Biu-Mandara languages that are a little further away from that cluster don't have that root. If we look at the other families within Chadic, West Chadic languages, their words for either trade or buy are quite varied. There's a few clear pairs of cognates in there, but it would be very difficult to do any sort of general reconstruction of a word for trade or buy among all of these languages. Any sort of Proto-West Chadic word for this language would be difficult to reconstruct. And likewise for East Chadic languages, there's not a lot of very obvious cognates here. It'd be difficult again to reconstruct any form for trade or buy from East Chadic languages. So there's quite a bit of variation, and it's not clear if that variation may be due to contact, or it could potentially be due to some kind of a cycle in the semantic or lexical shift that's happening that I'll come back to at the end of this talk. I'll say briefly something about the 2 languages that have both a by and a cell form in addition to having a general word for trade. Here I'll just present what the forms for by are, and then I'll come back to these 2 languages a bit later when talking about forms for cell. So one of the languages is Moloko, Biu-Mandara language that has this word skom, which can mean trade. But if you add a ventive suffix to it, it means buy. The other language that has this pattern is Psikie, which has the word ba for meaning trade. And if you add the suffix that's been glossed as an across, another kind of directional suffix, it also means buy in that context. So 2 different kinds of directionals are used for specifying that a word which can have a general meaning of either trade or buy means buy in particular. It's directionals that are used for that in both of these languages. Now to look at forms for expressing cell across these languages. 40 of the 47 languages have documentation of either a lexical root or a derived verb stem in order to express specifically a selling event. So 23 cases, it's a verb root that's completely different from the root for buy or trade. And in 17 cases, it's a stem that's morphologically derived from the verb stem that means either trade or buy. Looking at how those are spread across language families, with the yellow dots here representing languages that have a distinct verb root for saying sell, and the red dots here being languages that derive their form from sell from the verb for trade or buy. We see that there's not a very clear correlation between language subgroup or geographic area and whether you use one of these 2 strategies for stem. It seems to be quite arbitrary. When languages do have a particular verb root to express sell, it's again only the Biu-Mandara South languages where we see clear cognates. So in those Biu-Mandara South languages, we see this very clear bur stem that's used to express sell quite consistently. Biomandara North doesn't really have clear cognates. It's a potential pair there, and maybe some of the things that could be reconstructed. West Chadic and East Chadic, where we do see particular stems that are used for expressing cell. There's not a lot of evidence of cognates there. There's some potential cognates that could potentially be reconstructed, but it's not obvious that we see cognate forms for cell across these languages. And so what are some of the reasons for that variation? Well, one reason is that there's lots of potential sources for taking a verb root that has some other meaning and using it to express cell. So one of those would be the concept of losing something, to lose. So in Bahrain, for example, and this is I think true in Mawa, also in East Chadic language, the expression to sell is also used. The same verb can be used, at least in this case, in another form. The same verb can be used to express to be lost. So there's this correlation between the meaning to be lost and to sell, where it seems like speakers took a verb meaning to lose and used it to mean to sell something. You might also have a motion verb to express sell. That appears to be the case in Lamang, where the verb squaw for buy and zawa for sell parallel the forms for squaw, count, and za, go, these general motion verbs. So it appears that the verb for sell is derived from the verb go in this language. In Glavda, it's reported that the word for sell also means give. So that's another potential source for getting a word to mean sell, distinct from buy. In Mafa, it's reported that the word for sell also means to untie. So that's another potential source. However, that same form or very similar form, the one that we see all across the Biomandara South languages, has been reported by Buwal speakers to be seen as a borrowed word. So potentially there's also language contact as another source for getting a verb stem that specifically means sell in contrast with buy or a general trading word. Now, looking at the languages that don't have a particular distinct verb root for expressing sell, but instead use some kind of verbal morphology, there are several different strategies that are used. So out of the languages, I think it's 16 languages that do this. There's 5 languages that use a causative form of the verb that means trade or buy in order to mean sell. There's 3 languages that use what's called an oblique form, and oblique is another valency increasing operation similar to applicative, but more restricted in its uses. A few other languages use directionals, and that could be an itive, as in 2 languages. Could be an outward suffix, which is different from itive in that it contrasts with inward, so it's leaving a space rather than just going away from a didactic center. And then you could also have at least one language and possibly 2 languages where there's a ventive form that's used to express sell. And in a few languages, there is some morphology there, but it's not clear what it is. So to generalize a bit, when we see languages using verbal morphology to make a distinction between buying and selling, they're either using a valency increasing device to express selling, or they're using some kind of directional to express selling as distinct from buying. To return to the 2 languages that have specific forms for both buy and sell, just to look at those patterns. In Molucco, we see that it's the ventive that expresses buying and the itive that expresses selling. And Psikia, we see a different pattern where we see it's this across suffix that expresses buying and the outward suffix that expresses selling. So 2 different strategies for finding ways to take a general word that could mean either buy or sell, making it specific both in terms of buying and in terms of selling. It's interesting to look at the ventive in particular, and that's kind of what got me into this topic in the first place, because the ventive has so many different apparent functions across Chadic languages that it starts to seem intriguing, yet apparently impossible to come up with any kind of generalized analysis of the ventive. So looking at these 2 examples, in Molucco, we see that the general word for trade in its ventive form means buy in particular, where in Bole, a West Chadic language, we see that the general word for trade in its ventive form means sell. And so it's the same kind of concept. We have this general word that can mean buy or sell, and you add a ventive to it, and yet we get 2 different results. And so what this shows us is that the meaning of ventive in this context, at least in general, I think with motion verbs, is not very systematic across languages. And so it's not possible in this kind of a case to sketch out a basic meaning of ventive across Chadic languages, or many times even within one language. Rather, what we see is that these motion suffixes, these directionals, get extended and retooled when they're added to particular non-motion verbs, such that their meanings are not predictable from their parts. And so we don't see this kind of schematic, predictable compositional semantics, but rather we see that words in these cases look more like constructions that are memorized and learned as a whole. Even if there's some logic that can be reconstruction behind the metaphor, the meaning itself is not predictable from the parts. I think this is true for other directionals in Chadic languages, and this is probably true of some uses of the causatives as well. So I don't have a complete reconstruction, of course, of any of these forms, and in general, there's not a lot of lexical reconstruction in Chadic anyway. But we can see a few patterns that give us some idea of what's happening diachronically here. We can assume based on the asymmetry that there's this general word meaning buy or sell, and that speakers have a need to specify it. They come up with a way to specify sell. And one possible thing that happens if you do that after you have a specific form for sell is that your word that could mean buy or sell then no longer has to have both meanings, and then you simplify its meaning into just meaning buy, so that could become more specific, that kind of lexical shift. Of course, there could also be an interim phase where you have three different forms, one that's general and two that are specific, and then you lose the general form. And you could potentially have a situation where you come up with specific forms for buy or sell, and then lose your general form for trade. And if that kind of thing is happening, that would certainly explain the variation among the forms that could mean buy or trade. That there may be a kind of cycle here where once you have a specific form for buy, then you regeneralize that meaning, and then it no longer looks like words for trade in other languages. But we don't know exactly what's happening in particular languages. What we have seen already in the maps is that the use of a lexical cell stem, or the choice of using a particular verb stem to express cell versus derivations or other strategies, this doesn't correlate with different subgroups across Chadic languages. And so it's not really a predictor of genetic relationships. In other words, it seems to have innovated multiple times and potentially be a recent innovation in some cases. Likewise, um, it's only really in these Dabaic languages, that subgroup within Biomandara South, where we see a really strong pattern where all the languages, these 6 or 7 languages, have the same root for buy or trade and the same verb root for sell. There we see a particular pattern, but elsewhere in Chadic, it's really diverse. And even if you look at the languages that do have that SKM, that scum or scam or scum, that root for buy or trade, they also vary in how they express sell. So outside of Biomandara South, some of them have different lexical verbs for expressing sell. Some of them, at least one has an itive for expressing sell, two use a causative form of the by trade verb for sell, and others use an oblique. So even where we can trace cognates, where we see that it's the same verb stem that's being used to express buy or trade, some of the languages that are still fairly closely related still choose to go in different directions in terms of their strategy for expressing sell. One thing we do see is that in East Chadic, it's less common to have a derived version of the form of the verb for buy or trade to express sell. And in general, East Chadic languages seem to be a bit different in their morphology anyway. There's a lot less in terms of extension and directionals, so that may be a correlation there. But that's really the only pattern we see. Otherwise, you can't really predict or explain why some languages have chosen a derivational path towards expressing sell versus a new lexical stem for expressing sell. If we do look across all of these sort of different subgroups within Chadic languages, what we see is that the strategy that seems to be most widespread for coming up with a verb to express sell that's derived from a verb meaning trade or buy is some kind of valency increasing method. So that's the causative that occurs in all kinds of families, or the oblique. That seems to be the most widespread thing. We see that on the map as well. There are some other potential patterns in here where the use of the ventive only occurs in West Chadic and the use of the itive only occurs in Central Chadic, but they only have 2 examples of each, so it's not a lot of data there for making generalizations. So finally, a few words of conclusion. The one clear pattern here is this asymmetry, where the presence of a particular form, whether that's a lexical stem or derived verb that's composed of a stem plus a some kind of morphology. For expressing by, if there's a specific form for by, there will also be a specific form for sell in the language. In other words, when speakers feel like the need to make this distinction between buy and sell, at least within Chadic languages, they consistently choose to create a form for expressing sell rather than creating a form for expressing buy. This also sort of implies that there was some historical stage and maybe multiple historical stages where there was no buy sell distinction that gave need for this creation of new ways of expressing sell specifically. But it's not really clear why or how exactly this came about in particular languages. We also see that these forms of buy and sell across Chadic languages are very heterogeneous. They're not really indicative of genetic relationships. It's not always clear why these changes are happening across these languages or why these aren't more consistent forms of verbs that can be compared across Chadic languages. And then it's also interesting to look at the diversity of affixes that are used to derive sell from a verb meaning trade or buy, because it's not at all systematic. You can't at all predict why a particular suffix, whether it's used elsewhere for a causative or directional or whatever it is, how that comes to mean sell in a particular language. In other words, word formation in these contexts can't be analyzed in any kind of generalizable rule-based approach. But you rather need sort of some kind of something closer to a construction-based assumption of how we come up with these words. And that the attempts that you see from time to time of people who try to describe a general meaning of ventive or try to reanalyze the causative, you looking at examples like this as part of their explanation of some kind of really abstract, deep meaning of these forms is probably an unproductive exercise. That rather we should just say that yes, speakers are creative, they have used different strategies for making these forms, and then they memorize these forms and use them. But there's no deep semantics here in the meaning of the ventive or the meaning of the causative, such that in particular languages it can be combined with buy to mean sell. In other languages it isn't combined that way. Rather, these are just patterns that speakers come up with creatively and learn and then teach the next generation. So that's my thought. Thank you for listening. I'll share, I think, most of my references here. I'm happy to chat with anybody who'd like to see more references or talk more about the data.